She actually called it a depressing propeller for poor people. That's what my neighbor said to my face about the wind turbine I'd just spent 2 weekends installing with my own hands. If you've ever dealt with a neighborhood tyrant who hides behind HOA rules and weaponized smiles, hit that like button. And if you've been on the receiving end of petty suburban warfare, tell me your story in the comments, because mine starts with clean energy and ends with glorious reflection. Let me back up. I'd been living in Rosegate Oaks for about 6 months when energy bills started creeping up. Nothing drastic, just enough to make me look for alternatives. I'm an engineer by trade, not the flashy kind, just a quiet guy who enjoys solving problems. So I did my research, ran the numbers, and ordered a compact vertical axis wind turbine. Quiet, efficient, small footprint. Perfect for the corner of my backyard that caught a steady breeze. Installation took a few days. Concrete footing, wiring into the system, testing the inverter. I even added a low fence to keep it safe from the local kids' soccer ball adventures. By the end of the week, I was producing enough energy to shave 15–20% off my bill. I was proud of it. Then came Susan. I'd seen her before, always in pastel cardigans, perfectly sprayed hair, and the kind of pinched expression that said, "Someone's about to get a citation." She wasn't the HOA president, but everyone knew she was the HOA. She walked the block like a hall monitor with subpoena power. She showed up at my front porch one morning with a clipboard and a travel mug labeled "Blessed." "I noticed your new installation," she said, looking past me toward the turbine. "Yep," I smiled, trying to go a little greener. She gave me that thin-lipped look reserved for parking violations and sagging Halloween decorations. "Well, some of us moved here for the aesthetic consistency." "I checked the guidelines," I said. "No mention of renewable energy structures being prohibited, and the turbine is well below height limits." She sipped from her mug. "It's not just the rules, it's the tone of the neighborhood. And frankly, it's a bit ugly, like something you'd see on a farm." I bit my tongue. She continued, "I've spoken with a few residents. People are concerned. It looks industrial. Some even say it brings down property values." That night, a formal HOA notice appeared in my mailbox. Non-conforming exterior modification under review. 2 days later, a second notice. Pending visual impact assessment by the HOA Aesthetics Subcommittee. 3 days after that, a $75 fine for unapproved structural addition. I appealed. I submitted photos, specs, even the exact paragraph in the bylaws that said energy-saving equipment was allowed as long as it didn't exceed 12 feet. Mine was 9.8. I even offered to paint the base to match the trim of my house. No response. Then one morning, I caught Susan in my backyard. She stood near the fence, squinting at the turbine with her arms crossed, as if sheer contempt could stop the wind. "Can I help you?" I asked from the porch. "I'm documenting. For the board." "Without permission?" She smiled sweetly. "You should really reconsider your setup. It just doesn't belong here." Later that week, I got a letter. Final notice before further action. And that's when I stopped trying to play by her rules. Because I realized, if Susan wanted a war over appearances, I was ready to fight it. But I wouldn't raise my voice. I'd raise light. They got me on a technicality. According to the letter I received from the HOA, my turbine needed to be reviewed under the Community Visual Harmony Clause, a vague catch-all rule that basically let the board decide if something simply looked wrong. No height issue, no noise complaints. Just the opinion that it disrupted the natural flow of property aesthetics. I could appeal, but the appeals board? 3 people. One of them was Susan. The vote was 2-1. I'll let you guess who the lone no was. So I had to take the turbine down. It sat in my garage like a gutted fish. Still useful, still beautiful to me, but silenced. That night, I opened my windows to let in the breeze, and all I could hear was Susan's smug voice in my head. "It just doesn't belong here." I could have written angry emails, could have ranted at the next HOA meeting. But people like Susan feed on that kind of attention. What they can't handle is subtle resistance, quiet defiance, something they can't trace back to you, but can't escape either. So I waited and watched. Susan's house sat directly across from mine, diagonal. Perfect visibility of my front yard, which she used to monitor like a hawk with binoculars. But more interestingly, her bedroom was on the east side of the house. Big arched window, no tree cover. Every morning around 6:30 a.m., light streamed through it like a spotlight. That's when the idea started to take shape. If wind energy offended her aesthetic sensibilities, maybe she'd prefer solar. I started reading, not just about panels, but about reflectivity, angle, placement, thermal efficiency. There's a common misconception that solar panels are dull or matte. Not all of them. Some high-efficiency models have mirrored finishes, especially when freshly clean. And if angled just right, they can bounce a beam of morning sunlight like a signal flare. I ran simulations on my laptop using solar angle calculators and neighborhood schematics. If I positioned the panels on the right side of my roof, the slope that faced Susan's window, I could direct sunlight into her bedroom with almost surgical precision. Nothing illegal, nothing dangerous, just inconvenient. I submitted a request to the HOA. This time, it was airtight. Solar panels were fully protected under state clean energy laws. The HOA could not legally deny installation as long as the mounting followed building code and didn't pose a safety hazard. They had no choice. Approval granted. The crew arrived the next week. I stood in the driveway as they bolted sleek, reflective panels to my roof. Susan came out with her phone, snapping pictures like she was gathering evidence for a war crimes tribunal. "What are you doing?" she hissed from across the street. "Going solar," I said. Figured I'd try another form of green energy since wind offended people. Her mouth opened, then closed. She turned and stormed back inside. By day 3, the job was done. 5 gleaming panels stretched across the eastern edge of my roof. Clean, polished, and angled perfectly. I watched the sunrise the next morning from my kitchen. At 6:42 a.m., the first beam reflected off the glass and lit up Susan's front window like a theater spotlight. Curtains twitched. A silhouette appeared. And then, the blinds snapped shut like a trap. I smiled and took a sip of coffee. War doesn't always require noise. Sometimes it just takes a little light. The first week was delightful. Every morning, like clockwork, the sun rose, and with it, so did the beam from my solar panels. Right into Susan's window. At 6:41 a.m., a flash of light would glide across her curtains, and by 6:42 they were shut tight. I didn't need to watch the clock. The rhythm was perfect. She tried ignoring it. For the first few days, she left the blinds closed until well after noon. But that meant she was living in a dark room, and Susan didn't seem like the kind of person who enjoyed feeling boxed in. Then came the modifications. First, she swapped out the curtains for blackout panels. Thick, gray, ugly, clashing hard with her otherwise prim and proper aesthetic. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who'd destroyed my wind turbine for ruining the look of the neighborhood had just turned her bedroom into a cave. I almost felt bad. Almost. But then I saw her one afternoon standing at the corner of her driveway with a tape measure and a notepad, staring up at my panels like they were a personal insult. That's when I knew she hadn't given up. Sure enough, a few days later, I received a new notice. This one was rich. Concerns have been raised regarding the potential reflection of solar installations into neighboring homes, possibly violating residential peace and comfort standards. It was unsigned, of course, and meaningless. State law was clear. Solar installations, once approved, were untouchable unless they posed a documented hazard. Sunlight, last I checked, was not a hazard. Still, I replied with a smile, please define comfort standards in measurable terms. Also, please clarify how reflected sunlight constitutes a policy violation. No response. The next attempt was more creative. Susan scheduled a courtesy inspection from the city energy office. I greeted the inspector with coffee and a printed copy of the installation permit, photographs of the angles, and a time-stamped weather report showing panel orientation compliance. The guy chuckled halfway through. Someone's really bothered by this, huh? I shrugged. Just trying to be green. He signed off without a single issue. But Susan wasn't done. She began hosting impromptu HOA walkthroughs on Saturday mornings, dragging a few reluctant board members along as she pointed at my roof like I was committing aerial vandalism. They're angled to intentionally disturb, I overheard her say. I thought they were supposed to face the sun, one of the board members mumbled. I stayed out of it, because what Susan didn't understand was that the more she fought, the more obvious her obsession became. And the more obvious it became, the less the neighborhood took her seriously. Amanda, the real estate agent who lived 2 doors down, even stopped me during one of my evening walks. Hey, she said, not that it's any of my business, but I love the panels. You're probably the only house on the block actually doing something forward-thinking. Appreciate that, I replied. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. Between you and me, a few of us are thinking of running for new HOA seats this year. We're kind of over the drama. The seed had been planted. Meanwhile, Susan grew more frantic. She installed an oversized sunshade on her window, one of those motorized ones that looked like it belonged at a beachfront villa, not in a cul-de-sac. It screeched when it extended and flapped like a dying sail in the wind. It looked ridiculous, and it couldn't hide the truth. She was losing. One night, I saw her pacing her yard on the phone, waving her hands, clearly arguing with someone. Her voice carried over the hedge. They're doing it on purpose. He knows exactly what he's doing. It's harassment. I turned off my porch light and smiled in the dark. No, Susan, it's sunlight. If there was one thing Susan hated more than losing control, it was losing it publicly. After the city inspection cleared me and the HOA failed to stop my solar panels, she tried one last angle: manufacturing sympathy. She began telling neighbors that the sunlight was causing her migraines, that it was targeted light harassment, and she was being victimized in her own home. The problem? No one believed her anymore. People were tired. Tired of the notices, tired of the drama, tired of being policed for things like lawn edging and curtain colors. Susan had spent years being the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, but now her throne was wobbly. Then came the incident that finally cracked her image for good. It was the monthly HOA meeting, usually a dull, underattended affair held in the community clubhouse. But this one? Packed. Word had spread that new board seats were opening up, and people had opinions. Susan showed up early, as always. Clipboard, binder, talking points. She took her usual seat at the front, ready to command the room. But the room didn't cooperate. Amanda, the agent, stood up first. I'd like to open with a proposal to revise the HOA charter to clearly define the limits of aesthetic enforcement, she said. Susan interrupted almost immediately. If this is about the solar panels, that matter is ongoing. Amanda raised a hand. No, this is about abuse of power and the fact that one person's personal taste has been allowed to override state laws, neighbor goodwill, and basic common sense. A few people applauded. Susan's lips thinned. I've dedicated years to keeping this community beautiful. And in the process, Amanda replied, you've alienated more than half of it. Another voice chimed in from the back. Mr. Halverson, who had lived on the block since the 90s. Susan fined me $50 last year because my porch pumpkin rotted before the pickup date. Laughter. I received a letter because my son left his skateboard on the front steps, someone else added. She took my wind chimes, came another voice. It snowballed. The room turned. Susan stood, tried to speak, but her voice was drowned in overlapping complaints. Nothing aggressive, just long, suppressed frustration pouring out. People weren't yelling. They were done. She turned to the board members, the few who still backed her, but their faces were blank, neutral, political. And then I stood. I moved here for peace, for space. I never imagined I'd have to fight for the right to use clean energy on my own property. But here we are. I let the silence linger. And it's not about wind or solar or sunlight. It's about control and the idea that one person's discomfort is more important than everyone else's progress. The room went quiet. Susan stared at me, not angry, not even bitter, just lost. The meeting ended with a motion to review all recent HOA penalties issued in the past 12 months. A separate vote was scheduled to fill Susan's position on the board. Amanda was nominated on the spot. The next morning, I noticed something different. Susan's SUV, the one she washed every weekend, was covered in dust. No more HOA patrols, no measuring tape, No clipboard. Her motorized sunshade stayed down, but her blinds, open. It was almost symbolic, like she'd finally let in the light. That weekend, Amanda knocked on my door. "We're organizing a sustainability initiative," she said. "Solar info night, maybe a community compost setup. Would you be willing to help?" "Absolutely." As she turned to leave, she paused. "You know, for what it's worth, you played it right. Never lost your cool." I smiled. I let the panels speak for themselves. Change doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it just settles in, quietly, like light creeping under a door. A month after the HOA meeting, things in Rosegate Oaks felt different. Calmer. There were fewer notices taped to mailboxes, more people walking in the evenings, chatting on porches. A few homes even started putting up small garden boxes in front yards, something Susan had once frowned upon as too rural. And me? I reinstalled the wind turbine. Legally, of course. After the board reevaluation, the aesthetic clause was rewritten with specific limitations, and my turbine, already compliant by state standards, passed without a hiccup. No more gray area, no more threats. When the blades began turning again, I watched from the porch, coffee in hand, and felt a small knot inside me loosen. I hadn't just won a personal fight. The neighborhood had changed. The mood, the culture, the expectations. People stopped being afraid of rocking the boat, of expression, of color. As for Susan, she didn't attend the next two HOA meetings. Her front yard, once obsessively manicured, began showing small signs of surrender. A few dandelions, a garden gnome that hadn't been approved. Nashtin, she still walked her little dog, but the way she held herself had changed. Less rigid, less regal. We hadn't spoken since the meeting, until one Sunday morning. I was checking the turbine cables when I heard a cautious voice behind me. "It's quiet." I turned. Susan stood on the edge of my lawn, holding a cup of tea. "The turbine," she clarified. "I thought it'd be louder." "It's actually quieter than my AC unit," I replied. She nodded, eyes on the spinning blades. "I read about them. After everything." I didn't say anything. She took a breath. "I thought I was protecting something. Order, maybe. But I think I just made everything smaller. Less human." I raised an eyebrow. That was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever expect from her. "Change is uncomfortable," I said. "But that doesn't make it wrong." She looked up at my roof, at the mirrored panels still shining like armor in the morning sun. "They really do reflect light right into my bedroom." I waited. She smiled, just a little. "But it's not the worst way to wake up." And with that, she walked away. No clipboard, no lecture, just a neighbor. Later that week, Amanda and I hosted the first neighborhood Green Night, a casual gathering in the clubhouse with snacks, flyers, and a local installer giving free consultations. It wasn't flashy, but it was full. People came with questions, with curiosity, with openness. That night, as the last guests filtered out, I stood in the parking lot and looked back at the clubhouse glowing under the warm yellow lights. Progress, not explosive, not dramatic, just steady, like wind, like light. I walked home under a sky full of stars, the soft hum of the turbine behind me, and the solar panels gleaming faintly in the dark, catching the moon. And for the first time in a long time, I felt completely and peacefully at home.